The night of December 7th, 1944, outside the Belgian town of Bastogne, Private First Class Raymond Gantter of the 328th Infantry Regiment watched a Sherman tank crew do something that made no tactical sense whatsoever. Instead of sleeping inside their tank where 30 tons of steel offered protection from the sub-zero cold, all 5 men were digging frantically beneath the vehicle, hollowing out a trench in the frozen ground just wide enough for their bodies. Gantter approached the tank commander, Sergeant Dale Morrison, and asked the obvious question: why sleep in frozen mud when you've got a heated crew compartment 10 feet away? Morrison didn't look up from his digging. He just pointed to a burned-out Sherman Hulk 200 yards down the road, its turret blown 15 feet from the chassis, and said 3 words that explained everything. 88mm shell. German 88mm anti-tank guns could penetrate a Sherman's armour from over 2,000 yards. But those same shells, travelling at 2,700 feet per second with enough kinetic energy to punch through 4 inches of steel, couldn't penetrate 18 inches of Belgian dirt. The mathematics were brutal and simple. Tank armour stopped nothing that mattered. The ground beneath the tank stopped everything. By December 1944, tens of thousands of American tank crewmen across Europe had independently arrived at this same conclusion. They'd learned through experience measured in burning vehicles and dead friends that sleeping inside a Sherman tank wasn't protection. It was a death trap. The Germans had a specific tactic for dealing with American armour at night. They'd pre-register artillery coordinates on known tank positions, wait until crews bedded down for the evening, then drop high-explosive shells mixed with armour-piercing rounds onto the parked vehicles. A direct hit from an 88mm shell would penetrate the Sherman's top armour, detonate inside the crew compartment, and kill everyone instantly through overpressure and fragmentation, even if it didn't ignite the ammunition. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Crews sleeping under their tanks, bodies pressed into shallow trenches scraped from frozen earth, survived these bombardments when their vehicles didn't. The shells that would have killed them exploded harmlessly 6 feet above their heads, blocked by the tank's hull and suspension. This survival tactic, never officially sanctioned, never appearing in any army field manual, spread through American armoured units in Europe like wildfire through late 1944 and early 1945. It represented the ultimate admission that the Sherman tank, America's primary armoured fighting vehicle that had carried the nation through 3 years of war across 2 continents, could not protect its crews from the weapons they faced. The men who operated these machines had lost faith in the very armour that was supposed to keep them alive. To understand how American tank crews reached this point, where they trusted dirt more than steel, requires understanding the weapon that destroyed that faith. The German 88mm gun, originally designed as anti-aircraft artillery, that became the most feared anti-tank weapon of World War II. The 88mm Flak 18, entering service in 1933, was never intended to fight tanks. German engineers at Krupp designed it to shoot down bombers at high altitude, requiring a flat trajectory, high muzzle velocity, and shells that could reach aircraft flying at 20,000 feet. The gun excelled at this role, but its characteristics, particularly that high velocity, made it accidentally perfect for a role its designers never considered: destroying armoured vehicles. The first combat use of 88mm guns against tanks occurred almost by accident during the Spanish Civil War in 1936. German Condor Legion forces, supporting nationalist forces, found themselves facing Republican T-26 tanks that their standard 37mm anti-tank guns couldn't penetrate. In desperation, they pressed 88mm anti-aircraft guns into direct fire rolls and discovered something remarkable. The shells punched through tank armour like it didn't exist. German commanders took note, but the lesson didn't fully register until France in May 1940. General Erwin Rommel, commanding the 7th Panzer Division, used 88mm guns in anti-tank rolls during the breakthrough at Sedan, destroying French heavy tanks that German tank guns couldn't threaten. The success was so dramatic that by 1941, the German army had formally incorporated 88mm guns into anti-tank doctrine. The ballistics were devastating. The 88mm shell weighed approximately 20 pounds and left the barrel at 2,700 feet per second. At 1,000 yards, it could penetrate 4 inches of vertical steel plate. At 2,000 yards, still 3 inches. This performance exceeded every Allied tank gun in service through 1943 and matched or exceeded most anti-tank weapons that wouldn't enter production until 1944. The gun could engage targets at ranges where Allied tankers couldn't even see clearly through their optics, let alone return effective fire. Against early Sherman tanks arriving in North Africa in late 1942, the 88mm gun was grotesquely overpowered. The M4 Sherman's frontal armour measured 2 inches thick on the hull, just under 3 inches on the turret front, and barely 1 inch on the top. An 88mm shell hitting the frontal arc had enough energy to penetrate, pass completely through the fighting compartment, exit the rear armour, and continue travelling. Hits to the thinner top armour, common when the gun fired from elevated positions or used high-angle trajectories, resulted in catastrophic kills. The shell would penetrate the roof, detonate inside the crew compartment among stored ammunition, and turn the entire vehicle into an explosion that left nothing recognizable. The psychological impact of facing 88mm guns proved almost as destructive as the physical damage. Tank crews developed acute awareness that they could be killed at ranges where they had no chance to fight back. The distinctive crack of an 88mm gun firing, different from the boom of tank cannons or the duller thump of howitzers, became a sound that triggered instant terror. Veterans learned to recognize it and immediately began evasive action, knowing that hesitation measured in seconds meant death. Crews in North Africa during 1942 and 1943 reported that German 88mm guns positioned in hull-down defensive positions could engage American Shermans from beyond effective return fire range. The Sherman's 75mm M3 gun, excellent against infantry and light vehicles, lacked the velocity and penetration to threaten 88mm gun positions at the ranges where the German guns could kill Shermans. This created a tactical nightmare. American tanks had to close to within 800 yards or less to have any chance of knocking out an 88mm position, and during that approach, the German gun could fire perhaps 10 aimed shots. A competent German crew could service their weapon, loading and firing, approximately every 6 seconds. That meant they could potentially destroy 5 Sherman tanks during the time it took American armour to close from maximum engagement range to effective firing distance. The mathematics weren't theoretical. They played out in North African wadis and Italian valleys, with burned-out American tanks marking the calculations. 1st Armoured Division after-action reports from Tunisia in early 1943 documented cases where single 88mm guns, properly positioned and supplied with ammunition, had destroyed 4 or 5 Sherman tanks before being silenced. The reports noted with grim precision that American casualties in these engagements included not just destroyed vehicles, but entire crews killed inside tanks that became crematoriums when ammunition ignited. The 88mm shell's penetration characteristics meant that hits rarely resulted in crew survival. Unlike glancing strikes that might wound crewmen while leaving the vehicle partially operational, 88mm penetrations tended to be catastrophic events. The shell, travelling at supersonic velocity, created a pressure wave inside the confined crew compartment that could kill through overpressure alone even before fragmentation and fire effects. Medical reports from field hospitals treating tank crew survivors documented that men pulled alive from vehicles hit by 88mm shells typically suffered from blast lung, ruptured eardrums, and traumatic brain injuries beyond the obvious burns and fragmentation wounds. German forces employed 88mm guns in both towed and self-propelled configurations by 1943. The towed Flak A-18, Flak A-36, and Flak A-37 variants could be positioned in prepared defensive positions with excellent fields of fire and substantial protection for their crews. The self-propelled variants, mounted on tank chassis to create vehicles like the Nashorn and later the Ferdinand tank destroyer, provided mobility while retaining the gun's devastating anti-tank capability. American tank crews faced the horrible reality that German doctrine called for 88mm guns to be employed in depth, meaning that even if American armor successfully destroyed one position, more guns waited behind it, each capable of inflicting the same losses. By mid-1943, tankers understood that the Sherman's armor provided psychological comfort only. It stopped small arms fire and shell fragments, but against the primary threat they faced, German anti-tank guns, particularly the 88mm, it was effectively decorative. This realization didn't come from intelligence briefings or technical reports. It came from watching friends die in vehicles that were supposed to protect them. The night defense problem emerged as casualties mounted. American armor doctrine called for units to defensive perimeter at night, with tanks positioned to provide mutual support and maximize fields of fire. Crews were expected to remain with their vehicles, maintaining readiness for counterattack or night infiltration attempts. In practice, this meant 5 men sleeping inside a 30-ton steel box that was an obvious target for any German artillery observer or forward observer team with access to a radio. German tactical doctrine specifically addressed night harassment of American armored positions. Artillery units maintained careful plots of known American tank concentrations and conducted harassing fire throughout the night, sometimes random timing, sometimes coordinated with intelligence about American rest schedules. The shells weren't intended to destroy entire units. They were meant to kill a few crews, damage some vehicles, and deny everyone else sleep through constant threat. The effectiveness exceeded German expectations. A single 88mm shell landing among parked Shermans could achieve a direct hit on a vehicle, penetrating the relatively thin top armor and killing the entire crew sleeping inside. Even near misses created deadly fragmentation that could pepper multiple vehicles and wound crews through open hatches or vision ports. American tankers began calculating survival odds and reached an uncomfortable conclusion. The odds of surviving inside a tank during night artillery were worse than the odds of surviving outside it. Technical Sergeant Belton Cooper, serving with the 3rd Armoured Division's Maintenance Battalion, documented this tactical evolution in his post-war memoir. He described visiting frontline tank units in late 1944 and finding crews who refused to sleep inside their vehicles despite regulations requiring it. When questioned, tankers explained with brutal mathematical logic. The tank's armour stopped nothing that German artillery would fire at them during the night. The tank's fuel and ammunition made it a bomb if hit. The confined interior meant that a penetrating shell killed everyone instantly through overpressure, even if fragmentation somehow missed. Outside the tank, under the tank specifically, the vehicle's own bulk provided protection while eliminating the risks of being inside a potential explosion. The transition from sleeping inside tanks to sleeping beneath them didn't happen uniformly or officially. It spread through informal channels, tank crews sharing survival information the way infantry shared knowledge about which German positions to avoid or which roads were mined. A crew that survived a night bombardment by sheltering under their vehicle would mention it to neighbouring units. Those crews would try it. If they survived when others didn't, the practice propagated further. By December 1944, during the Battle of the Bulge, the practice had become so widespread that unit commanders stopped trying to enforce regulations requiring crews to sleep inside their tanks. The evidence was too overwhelming. Crews sleeping beneath tanks during artillery bombardments survived at dramatically higher rates than crews sleeping inside, even though no official study existed to document the statistics. The knowledge was empirical, written in survival rather than reports. The physics behind this survival advantage were straightforward once examined. A Sherman tank hull sat approximately 18 inches off the ground when accounting for track height and suspension compression. That 18-inch gap, when supplemented by a shallow trench dug beneath the vehicle, created a protective void that shells couldn't reach. An 88mm shell fired in a high-angle trajectory would strike the tank's top armour, which was designed to deflect glancing blows, or would impact the ground around the vehicle. Either way, the tank's own mass shielded anyone beneath it from fragmentation and blast effects. The shell would have to literally burrow through 18 inches of frozen earth and then penetrate upward into the protected space, something its fuse design wasn't intended to accomplish. This protection extended to near misses as well. A shell landing 5 yards from a Sherman would create a lethal fragmentation pattern that could wound or kill anyone standing nearby. But men lying flat in trenches beneath the tank's centerline were shielded by the hull, suspension, and tracks. The same mass that made the Sherman an obvious target became its crew's life insurance when properly positioned, between the men and incoming fire. The irony wasn't lost on tankers. They'd been trained that armor protected them. They'd been told that the Sherman was a reliable, survivable vehicle that would bring them through combat safely. Yet combat experience taught them that the armor was a liability during artillery fire, turning their vehicle into a target, and that survival meant abandoning the protection they'd been promised in favor of the only protection that actually worked. Dirt. Simple, unglamorous, free dirt. The practice created its own complications that tankers had to solve through improvisation. Frozen ground in European winter made digging trenches beneath tanks brutally difficult. Crews learned to park their vehicles over the least frozen ground they could find, usually near buildings or tree lines where some shelter from wind existed. They'd use entrenching tools, bayonets, even improvised picks made from scrap metal to scrape out shallow depressions, barely deep enough for a bland man lying flat. The work was exhausting after a full day of combat operations, done in darkness to avoid attracting enemy fire, and had to be repeated every time the unit displaced to new positions. But the alternative was sleeping inside a vehicle that multiple crews had seen turned into a death trap by a single lucky German artillery round, and that wasn't really an alternative at all. Maintaining the tanks while living beneath them created practical problems. Engine maintenance required access to compartments that crews couldn't reach from underneath. Ammunition resupply meant climbing out of the protective trenches and working exposed. Radio watch, technically required around the clock, became harder to maintain when the radio operator was sleeping in a muddy trench 6 feet from the radio set itself. Tank commanders developed unofficial procedures to work around these issues, posting minimal watch crews inside vehicles, with explicit instructions to bail out at first warning of incoming fire, and hiding the practice from visiting officers who might enforce regulations nobody believed in anymore. Officers mostly pretended not to notice, because they understood the mathematics as well as their crews did. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The German artillery doctrine that made sleeping under tanks necessary had evolved throughout the war based on experience fighting American armored units. By late 1944, German artillery commanders understood American patterns. Tank units concentrated for night defensive perimeters. They positioned vehicles in predictable patterns based on American doctrine. They maintained strict radio discipline that meant they rarely moved at night unless operationally necessary. This predictability made them vulnerable to pre-registered artillery fires. German forward observers would spend daylight hours mapping American positions, noting tank concentrations and defensive patterns. After dark, they'd call in fire missions using coordinates established hours earlier, knowing American tanks would still be in roughly the same locations. The shells would arrive without warning. No sound of approaching vehicles or visible muzzle flashes, just sudden explosions among parked tanks. The mixture of high explosive and armor-piercing rounds in these fire missions was tactically deliberate. High explosive shells would detonate on impact, creating fragmentation and blast effects that wounded crews and damaged external equipment. Armor-piercing shells, particularly 88mm anti-tank rounds, would penetrate tank armor and detonate inside crew compartments, guaranteeing kills if they achieved direct hits. The combination meant that even if American tanks survived being penetrated, the crews might still be wounded or killed by the accompanying high-explosive rounds. American counter-battery fire and air superiority reduced but never eliminated this threat. German artillery units became expert at firing brief missions and immediately displacing before American counterfire could target their positions. The Germans understood they couldn't win sustained artillery duels against American firepower superiority, so they didn't try. They'd fire 10 or 15 rounds at known tank concentrations, displace to alternate positions, and repeat the process hours later from different locations. The cumulative effect was constant harassment that denied American crews rest and inflicted steady casualties without exposing German artillery to destruction. Tank crews responded to this threat with the only defense available to them. They abandoned the protection their vehicles theoretically provided and trusted the protection their vehicles accidentally provided when used as 30-ton overhead cover. This represented a fundamental failure of the armor protection concept, as applied to the Sherman tank, but tankers didn't waste time on philosophical analysis. They dug trenches, crawled underneath their vehicles, and slept fitfully while praying the next shell wouldn't be the one that landed directly on the tank above them. The practice wasn't without risks. A direct hit on a Sherman's fuel tank could create fires that would spread to crews beneath the vehicle faster than they could escape. Ammunition fires could cook off shells in unpredictable directions, potentially killing men sheltering underneath. The tank settling on its suspension overnight could trap sleeping crews if they positioned themselves poorly. And in a few documented cases, crews sleeping under tanks were crushed when vehicles shifted position due to ground subsidence or mechanical movement. But these risks were statistical outliers compared to the near-certain death of sleeping inside a tank during an artillery strike. Tankers had learned to calculate odds with brutal pragmatism. Every crew knew someone who'd died inside a tank that was hit during the night. Almost nobody knew someone who died sleeping under their tank during a bombardment. The mathematics weren't complicated. The psychological impact of this adaptation rippled beyond simple survival tactics. Tankers who slept beneath their vehicles every night, who literally dug themselves shallow graves that might become real if they miscalculated, internalized a message about their equipment and their mission. The tank wasn't protection. It was a weapon they operated, a tool they used, but not something they could trust with their lives when they were at their most vulnerable. This realization affected combat performance in ways difficult to measure but impossible to ignore. Crews who had lost faith in their vehicles' protective qualities became more cautious, less willing to take risks that pre-war doctrine assumed tankers would accept. The aggressive armored maneuvers that American doctrine called for required crews who believed their armor would keep them alive when they pressed forward into enemy fire. Crews sleeping in muddy trenches every night had stopped believing that months ago. Unit cohesion suffered in subtle ways that after-action reports struggled to quantify. Tank crews bonding over shared hardship was nothing new, but the specific hardship of digging trenches every night while knowing your vehicle couldn't protect you created a peculiar resentment. Men resented the tank for being inadequate. They resented the army for putting them in inadequate equipment. And they resented the Germans for having weapons that made American armor obsolete before the first shot was fired. Lieutenant Colonel William Hamburg, commanding a tank battalion in the 4th Armored Division, noted in his personal diary entries from January 1945 that morale problems stemmed not from combat losses themselves, but from the perception that losses were inevitable given the equipment mismatch. Crews understood that German anti-tank guns could kill them at ranges where they couldn't fight back, and that armor, which was supposed to protect them, was actually a liability that attracted fire without stopping it. The contrast with German tank crews was stark and frequently noted. German tankers in Panthers and Tigers believed their armor could protect them. That confidence showed in their tactical aggression and willingness to engage at extended ranges where their armor advantages were most pronounced. American tankers in Shermans knew their armor couldn't stop what German guns were shooting, so they relied on other advantages. Numerical superiority, artillery support, air superiority, and the grim calculus that German tanks were rare enough that most American Shermans would never face them directly. But at night, when artillery fell and numerical superiority didn't matter, American tankers slept in trenches beneath their vehicles because that was the only protection that worked. The official army response to this practice was carefully calculated non-response. No field manual was ever revised to authorize or recommend sleeping under tanks. No training directive was issued teaching proper trench digging beneath armored vehicles. But equally, no serious effort was made to stop the practice once it became widespread. Battalion and regimental commanders understood the survival statistics even without formal studies. Companies that slept under their tanks suffered fewer casualties from night artillery than companies that enforced regulations requiring crews to sleep inside. The evidence was anecdotal but overwhelming, and commanders prioritized keeping their men alive over enforcing regulations that increased casualties. Some officers tried to formalize the practice through unofficial channels. Captain James Burt, commanding a tank company in the 2nd Armored Division, incorporated trench digging into his unit's standard operating procedures for establishing night defensive positions. His instructions were explicit. Park the tank, dig a trench beneath it large enough for the entire crew, establish watch rotation that allowed most men to sleep in the trench, while one maintained radio contact from inside the vehicle. Burt never put these instructions in writing for fear they'd be countermanded by higher headquarters, but he trained his platoon leaders to teach the procedures to their crews, and the practice spread through his company by example. His unit suffered 0 casualties from night artillery during a 3-month period from December 1944 through February 1945, while adjacent units that didn't adopt the practice lost multiple crews. The correlation wasn't proof, but it was convincing enough that other commanders quietly copied his methods. The German perspective on this American adaptation remains poorly documented, but captured German artillery observers' notebooks and interrogation reports provide. Fragments. German forward observers reported frustration that night harassment fires on American tank positions produced fewer visible secondary explosions than expected. They'd noted that American crews appeared to abandon their vehicles at night, though they couldn't determine where the crews went or what protection they were using. Some German reports speculated that American tankers were sleeping in nearby buildings or foxholes, not realizing the protection was literally underneath the vehicles themselves. One captured German artillery officer, interrogated in February 1945, expressed surprise when American intelligence officers explained the sleeping under tanks practice. He'd calculated that direct hits on American tank concentrations should produce catastrophic ammunition, explosions, and multiple crew casualties per shell, but observed results showed fewer kills than his mathematics predicted. The explanation that crews weren't inside the vehicles during bombardments solved the discrepancy, but he noted with professional respect that it was an intelligent adaptation that reduced German artillery effectiveness significantly. His interrogation report included his assessment that American tankers were learning to survive through practical experience rather than doctrine, which he considered a dangerous development from the German perspective. Individual crew experiences varied, but common themes emerged from letters, diaries, and post-war interviews. The physical misery of sleeping in frozen mud was universally mentioned. Tankers described waking up with uniforms frozen to the ground, ice in their hair, and complete loss of feeling in extremities. They described the exhaustion of digging new trenches every single night after full days of combat operations and movement. They described the claustrophobia of lying flat beneath 30 tons of steel, unable to see anything, hearing every sound amplified and distorted. But they also universally described feeling safer in those miserable trenches than they ever felt sleeping inside the tank itself. Corporal Robert Sherrod, a bow gunner in a Sherman with the 3rd Armored Division, wrote to his family in January 1945, describing life at the front. His letter, preserved in the National Archives, included a matter-of-fact paragraph explaining that he slept under the tank every night because the Germans have guns that go through our armour, like it's made of tin, but they can't shoot through the ground. He described this as if it was the most natural thing in the world, noting that everybody does it now, and that officers had stopped complaining. His tone suggested he didn't consider this remarkable or even particularly worth discussing in detail. It was simply how things were done, the obvious solution to an obvious problem. The practice extended beyond just sleeping. Some crews began spending as much time as possible underneath or beside their tanks, during periods of static defense, emerging only when combat operations required it, or when maintenance demanded access to internal components. Tanks became mobile fortifications that crews operated from external positions whenever feasible, rather than armoured vehicles that protected their operators. This inverted the fundamental concept of tank warfare as it had been understood since World War I. Tanks were supposed to protect infantry and provide mobile protected firepower. Instead, American tankers in Europe by late 1944 were treating their vehicles as weapons they operated when necessary, but didn't trust for personal protection. The tank was a tool, a gun platform, transportation, but not a shelter. Supply officers reported unusual requisition patterns that reflected this adaptation. Requests for entrenching tools, particularly the smaller folding shovels that could fit in tank stowage, increased dramatically in late 1944. Canvas tarps and shelter, halves, normally infantry items, appeared on tank unit supply requests as crews improvised overhead cover for their trenches that wouldn't interfere with the protective shadow of the tank hull above them. Some units requisitioned sandbags in quantities that made no sense until supply officers realized crews were using them to line the edges of under-tank trenches, creating blast protection that supplemented the vehicle's mass. None of this appeared in official logistics reports as sleeping under tanks equipment, but the pattern was obvious to anyone tracking requisitions. Medical reports provided another data point. Tank crew casualties from night artillery bombardments decreased markedly in units that adopted under-tank sleeping compared to casualty rates from earlier in the war. A 3rd Army Medical Battalion report from February 1945, examining casualty causes across multiple armoured units, noted that blast and fragmentation wounds during night defensive positions had become relatively rare compared to rates from summer 1944. The report didn't explicitly connect this to sleeping practices, but the timing aligned perfectly with when the under-tank adaptation had become widespread. Fewer crews were inside vehicles when shells landed, so fewer crews were killed or wounded by penetrations and internal explosions. The adaptation created unexpected secondary effects on German tactical calculations. German commanders had assumed that American tank units concentrated in night defensive positions were vulnerable to massed artillery strikes that could destroy vehicles and kill crews simultaneously, degrading American armoured combat power before daylight battles even began. When night artillery fire consistently failed to produce the expected casualty rates, German planners were forced to allocate more artillery resources to achieve the same suppressive effects, straining an artillery arm already struggling with ammunition shortages and fuel restrictions that limited battery movements. By March 1945, as American forces pushed deeper into Germany itself, the sleeping under tanks practice had become so routine that new replacement crews learned it from veterans within days of joining their units, not from official training but from the informal education system that existed in every combat unit. A replacement crew arriving at a frontline tank company would be assigned a vehicle, receive a brief orientation on unit procedures, and within 24 hours would be shown by experienced crews how to dig a proper trench beneath a Sherman, where to position it to avoid the drive sprockets and road wheels, and how to arrange watch schedules that kept someone conscious inside the tank while allowing maximum crew rest in the trench. This knowledge transfer happened entirely outside official channels, never appearing in training manuals or doctrine documents, but with perfect efficiency because lives depended on it. The end of the war in May 1945 didn't immediately end the practice. American occupation forces in Germany during summer 1945 continued sleeping under their tanks whenever security situations warranted it. The threat had shifted from German artillery to potential partisan attacks or accidents, but the learned behavior persisted. Crews who had spent 6 months trusting dirt instead of armor didn't suddenly regain faith in their vehicles just because the shooting had stopped. Eventually, as occupation duties normalized and the intensity of threat decreased, crews returned to sleeping inside their vehicles or in more conventional shelter, but the transition took months. The post-war army studied the Sherman tank extensively, producing detailed analyses of its combat performance, survivability characteristics, and crew experiences. These studies documented armor penetration rates, mechanical reliability, and comparative performance against German armor. But the sleeping under tanks phenomenon appeared only as brief mentions in a few reports, treated as an interesting footnote rather than a significant tactical adaptation. The official narrative of Sherman combat effectiveness emphasized firepower, mobility, and mechanical reliability. It acknowledged armor deficiencies, but framed them as acceptable trade-offs for other advantages. The fact that crews had stopped trusting that armor entirely didn't fit the narrative comfortably, so it was mentioned sparingly and never analyzed in depth. Veteran tankers brought the knowledge home with them, but most didn't discuss it extensively. Post-war memoirs and interviews occasionally mentioned sleeping under tanks, usually in passing as one detail among many about frontline life. The practice didn't become part of popular understanding of tank warfare the way other adaptations did. Everyone knows about Sherman crews adding sandbags and extra armor plates to their vehicles, efforts to improve inadequate protection. Fewer people know that those same crews often abandoned their armored vehicles entirely at night, trusting 18 inches of frozen European dirt to stop shells that would punch through the steel above them without slowing down. The next generation of American tank designers absorbed some lessons from Sherman combat experience. The M26 Pershing heavy tank, arriving in limited numbers in the final months of the war, featured significantly thicker armor that could resist German 88mm fire at most combat ranges. The M46 Patton and subsequent Cold War American tanks continued this trend toward heavier armor protection, reflecting understanding that crews needed to trust their vehicles' defensive capabilities. But the fundamental tension remained between armor weight, mechanical reliability, and tactical mobility. Perfect protection was impossible without creating vehicles too heavy to move effectively or too expensive to build in useful numbers. Soviet tank design philosophy took different lessons from similar experiences. Soviet crews fighting German 88mm guns and other heavy anti-tank weapons developed their own survival adaptations, though their specific practices differed based on different tactical doctrines and operational conditions. Soviet tankers learned to trust their T-34's sloped armor more than American crews trusted Sherman armor, but they also learned to abandon disabled vehicles instantly and accept catastrophic loss rates as inevitable. The Soviet approach emphasized overwhelming numbers rather than individual vehicle survivability, accepting that many tanks and crews would be lost but calculating that enough would survive to accomplish the mission. This mathematical brutality shaped Soviet armor development through the Cold War, producing vehicles with adequate protection but emphasizing producibility and mechanical simplicity over crew comfort or maximum survivability. German post-war tank development, when the Bundeswehr was eventually reconstituted in the 1950s, showed clear influence from their wartime experience both inflicting and receiving tank casualties. The Leopard 1 main battle tank, entering service in 1965, emphasized a balance between firepower, protection, and mobility that reflected lessons learned from watching Allied armor struggle against German guns. But German designers also remembered their own late-war experiences when fuel shortages and mechanical breakdowns proved more lethal than enemy fire, teaching them that the best armor was worthless if the vehicle couldn't reach the battlefield. The Leopard incorporated reliability as a primary design requirement, something German wartime tanks had consistently failed to achieve. The sleeping under tanks adaptation represented a broader truth about combat that transcended specific technical details of Sherman armor or German 88mm guns. Soldiers will adopt whatever practices keep them alive, regardless of doctrine, regulations, or official procedures. When experience teaches that official methods don't work, troops improvise their own solutions and spread them through informal networks faster than any formal training system could operate. The army that wrote field manuals calling for tank crews to remain with their vehicles at night was the same army whose tankers were digging trenches under those vehicles because experience proved the field manuals were wrong. The disconnect between doctrine and practice wasn't failure of either. It was recognition that doctrine couldn't anticipate every tactical problem and that soldiers closest to the problem often developed the best solutions. American tankers sleeping in frozen mud beneath their Shermans weren't abandoning their duties or showing cowardice. They were demonstrating the practical intelligence that kept armies functional when conditions exceeded what planners had anticipated. The fact that this adaptation was never officially sanctioned or formally documented didn't reduce its importance. If anything, the organic spread of the practice through frontline units without any official approval demonstrated how effective informal knowledge networks were at propagating genuinely useful tactical innovations. The Sherman tank's legacy remains complex and frequently debated. It was America's most produced tank of the war, serving in every theater where American forces fought and continuing in service with Allied nations for decades after 1945. Its reliability and mechanical durability were exceptional, far exceeding German tank designs that looked impressive on paper but broke down constantly in field conditions. Its 75mm gun, adequate in 1942, was obsolete by 1944 against the latest German armour, though improved variants with 76mm guns partially addressed this deficiency. But its armour protection, the fundamental characteristic that was supposed to keep crews alive, was insufficient against the weapons it faced. This wasn't a design failure in the conventional sense. Sherman armour was adequate against most threats, stopping small arms fire, shell fragments, and lighter anti-tank weapons effectively. The problem was that most threats didn't include the German 88mm gun and other heavy anti-tank weapons that represented the most dangerous threats American armour faced. Designing a tank to defeat every possible weapon would have created a vehicle too heavy to transport, too expensive to build in quantity, and too mechanically complex to maintain. The Sherman represented conscious trade-offs that prioritized other capabilities over maximum armor protection. Those trade-offs resulted in American tank crews digging trenches in frozen ground every night because they knew their vehicle's armor wouldn't protect them from the weapons that most threatened them. The Sherman kept them mobile during the day, allowing them to move faster and farther than German tanks that broke down constantly. It kept their gun firing reliably when German tanks were deadlined for maintenance. It brought them to the battlefield consistently when German armour was stranded by fuel shortages or mechanical failures. But at night, when German artillery sought them out, they abandoned the protection their tank theoretically provided and trusted the protection that actually worked. The mathematics were written in survival rates that no one formally calculated but everyone understood. Crews sleeping under tanks lived through artillery bombardments that killed crews sleeping inside. The specific numbers were never compiled into an official study, but the knowledge was universal among frontline tankers. 18 inches of dirt stopped 88mm shells. 2 inches of Sherman armour didn't. The choice was obvious. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.